Austrian filmmaker Johannes Grenzfurthner returns to the Plutopia podcast this time. We discuss his new films, Hacking It Leaves, a documentary about the pandemic's impact on healthcare, and Solvent, a horror film set in Austria. Solvent is a found footage film that explores Nazi history and features his grandfather in photographs.
For people who have not seen it yet, it's a found footage film. So it's a point of view. So you see from the perspective of the main character, the expat who gets hired to look for some old historic Nazi documents in an old farmhouse. So there's a character played by myself who plays the grandson of that old Nazi character who died a couple of years or is disappeared a couple of years before the action in the film takes place. And so a couple of historians, they hire kind of like a salvage operator, so to speak, who is specialized in tracking like lost, hidden goods and stuff like that. So they go through the remnants and they go through this decrepit farmhouse trying to find the Nazi box with all the documents that the Nazi collected back in the days during the Second World War in a Polish concentration camp, and they discover more than the documents. They actually never discover the documents, but they discover more, and it's pretty much like a Nazi demon story. And I turned my own grandfather pretty much into the Nazi demon.
Hey, welcome everybody to the latest episode of the Plutopia News Network podcast. I'm one of your co-hosts, John Lebkowski. Our other co-hosts are Scoop Sweeney, who's not far away from where I am, and Wendy Grossman, who's logging in from London, England. And our guest today is the great Johannes Grenzfurthner, who is an Austrian filmmaker. He's also an artist, writer, actor, curator, theater director, performer, and lecturer. He does a lot of stuff. And he's the founder, conceiver, and artistic director of Monochrome, an international art and theory group which has been around for many, many years. And I've been aware of it for many years because Johannes and I go back to the zine world of the 90s. His movie production company is called Monochrome Propulsion Systems. So he is, I think, more a filmmaker now than anything else. His films deal with subversion, technology, nerd culture, of which we are part, politics, and the overall problems of life in 21st century capitalism with a capital C.
Very late capitalism, yeah.
And he's got two new films out, a documentary called Hacking It Leaves, which you can stream from the Internet Archive. And his other recent horror film, he has made some horror films. His recent one, Solvent, screened at this year's Fantastic Fest. And we'll talk about Hacking It Leaves, and we'll talk some about Solvent too. And I will just remind everybody who's listening to this to go to plutopia.io and click the link to subscribe via Patreon, and then agree to give us some money to subscribe, because we don't collect money in any other way, shape, or form. Well, you can send it via PayPal too, but we'd be happy to take your money. So thank you. Johannes,
Yay!
Welcome. So glad to see you.
Good to be on the show.
So you've been really busy. You have two films completed in 2024. Were you working on both of those at once?
No. So Hacking It Leaves, the documentary, I started working on that one pretty much like in March 2020. So right when the pandemic started, in the heyday of the pandemic, because it is related to the pandemic. So that was the crystallization point, was that that I had a pretty much like a Zoom call with a friend of mine from Colorado, from Durango, Ryan Finnegan, and that kind of like started off the whole process with Hacking It Leaves. And I was working on that one pretty much until like late 23 or early 24. So that was a long process. And around the same time, I guess in late 23, I started working on Solvent, which is my latest horror film. So there wasn't really an overlap, but they are somewhat related, I guess, in my brain because I was dealing with them at the same time. They are not related, of course. For most people, they wouldn't see any connections, but for me, both films deal with certain like horrors of the past, let's call it. And interestingly, both films feature hazmat suits quite excessively, so there's also a connection there going on. But
You looked
uh,
very cute in your hazmat suit.
oh, it was sweaty as hell, I can tell you. I was sweating like a pig.
I
Incredible.
bet.
And I only
And
shot for 2 days in the hazmat suit. I was like,
you were
I lost
wearing
like
it,
5 pounds.
but you were wearing it for so long in those shots.
Oh yeah, I was pretty much like in the hazmat suit for the 2 entire days that we shot the kind of like the narrative backbone of the documentary. So for people who haven't seen it yet, so I'm kind of like the host of Hacking at Leaves, and I'm wearing a hazmat suit, and it all starts out in a very 1970s control center where I contact all the people that I'm interviewing from there, and there's also like a backstory to that, but yeah, so far I've done 3 documentaries and 3 horror films in the last 10 years. So 6 feature film projects and 3 are documentaries and 3 are horror films. But the documentaries are also not straight up. I mean, they're kind of experimental in the way I approach the subject. So, and you can see that in Hacking It Leaves. And also, the horror films are not, they have a documentarian feel to it to a certain extent, I have to say. So there is kind of like a,
Well,
uh,
Solvent definitely
yeah,
does.
Solvent definitely does. Masking Threshold, my first horror film, has it as well. And Rat's Nest to a certain degree also, yeah.
How did you end up with John Gries in Solvent?
Oh,
How did you meet
that was a
him?
long story. So I'm not sure like how much I should really talk about the content because it's of course spoilery, but maybe I can tell, okay, let's decide that I can talk about the content, and people who want to be surprised by Solvent should probably switch off and watch it first before continuing to watch the our little video cast. So the story is the film is set in Austria, and I shot it on the old farm of my grandparents, who are both dead now. And so the content is that there is the main character is an American expat who lives in Europe for the last 30 years or so, and who was first moving out of the US because he was part in the army, part of Operation Desert Storm in the early 90s. And then he decided to stay in Europe or go to Europe. And then he ends up being a mercenary in the Yugoslav Civil War. And of course, I needed an American to play that character. Although you never see the character, it's a point of view film. So you hear the voice of the main character, but the hands of the main character are pretty much like my cameraman's. So
Was he
whatever you
actually
see,
there? I mean, is that
he
actually?
was no. He was never there during the actual shoot of the film. So I really, to that point, I only had a couple of Zoom calls with John Gries, and then when we recorded the voiceover, the pretty much like it was ADR, additional dialogue recording as it's called, but it's not additional dialogue recording. It's just like it's dialogue recording because you don't see anything else but hear John Grice's voice. And so my plan was, because he is from LA, to at some point like fly to LA and go into a sound studio with him for a day or two and watch footage together and record the stuff together with him. But it didn't work out because he was working in Thailand at the time on the 3rd season of The White Lotus, where he has a pretty important part. And so we ended up deciding that, okay, you go to a sound studio in Thailand and I call you from there via Zoom, like we're calling ours, like we're on the phone or on the video phone right now. And I directed him, watching him sit in a sound booth in Thailand, but it worked out super well. And interestingly, there was something wrong with the air conditioning, and it was super hot. It had like 30 degrees Celsius or something like that in the booth. I'm bad in Fahrenheit, I have to say. Like I'm going to the States for like 30 years, but I still don't know how to handle Fahrenheit. And
It's
but
86.
it was really hot,
It's
and
86 degrees Fahrenheit.
something like that. Yeah, yeah. And so he was sitting there and really sweating, and I was kind of worried because I saw that he was kind of like not super suffering, but it was like uncomfortable at least for him. And I told him, hey, can we can't just like postpone the whole thing, we record it next week if it works with you, and they can fix their air conditioning in the meantime, because it was like summer in Thailand, you know. And he said like, no, 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 it's perfect, we'll do it right now. And we we record the whole stuff chronologically anyways, and the character gets more and more desperate and desolate, and in the end he he melts into the ground. Major spoiler, of course. So it's just perfect that I use my uncomfortable state for the role. And he was so super nice about everything, and he's just like an incredible great guy and a real mensch, and it was super working with him. And I first then met him in person when we had the premiere of Solvent at the big genre film festival in Vienna. And he actually decided to come over. He even paid for his own ticket because he knew that we are in an independent production and we don't have so much money. And but he was so nice. He came for 2 days, and we had a super great premiere in Vienna of the film. And so whenever I'm going to LA, I'm always having a coffee with him because we became really good friends over the
Well,
production.
if you need more American expatriates for other projects, it should be easy to find. There is an exodus going on right now, thanks to the
Oh,
administration that we're inflicted with. So I
oh
have
yeah.
a number of friends who have, been long time, Texans or Californians, and they're no longer there. They're no longer in the United States, and they're kind of staying under the radar. But I get messages from them that it's much more comfortable to be in Europe.
It's interesting because many people I know from, like the net art scene and like nerd culture, some hackers from conferences like Hope, uh, some of them actually moved to Europe, but they did it interestingly, almost like they smelled what's gonna happen. Most of them actually moved before even the first Trump administration, but I think they probably felt that there's something in the air. There's a storm brewing.
Yeah.
And I know about like probably like 20 of my good friends from the Bay Area who moved either to Canada or Europe, some of them to Asia, like around the time of like, yeah, between 2010 and 2015, around that time. Yeah, so I can totally see that. Yeah.
And the Nazi references, which are an important part of Solvent. Um, I mean, I saw resonance with those with kind of what's going on here right now. It spooked me a little bit because, you could really feel the alignment of the vibes of what was happening then, and you were showing like one of your characters who is actually deceased and doesn't actually appear as
Yeah.
himself, the grandfather.
It's my actual grandfather who plays the character, but only in the old photographs from the photo albums. Yes, yes.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
wondered if those photos were all real, all from your
Oh, they're
life.
all
Is
real.
that
They're all
correct?
real. They're all
Okay,
real.
I thought
It's
so.
it's yeah, yeah. It's pretty much like for people who have not seen it yet. It's a found footage film. So it's a point of view. So yeah, you see from the perspective of the main character, the expat who gets hired to look for some old historic Nazi documents in an old farmhouse. So there's a character played by myself who plays the grandson of that old Nazi character who died a couple of years or is disappeared a couple of years before the action in the film takes place. And so a couple of historians they hire kind of like a salvage operator, so to speak, who is specialized in tracking like lost hidden goods and stuff like that. So they go through the remnants and this like they go through this decrepit farmhouse trying to find the Nazi box with all the documents that the Nazi collected back in the days in the during the Second World War in a Polish concentration camp. And they discover more than the documents. They actually never discover the documents, but they discover more, and it's pretty much like a Nazi demon story. And I turned
Yeah.
my own grandfather pretty much into the Nazi demon,
Yeah, I
and
was wondering about that. He wasn't really a Nazi, right?
now he was. It's interesting because I mean the core idea of the film, why I made the film, is that there is, of course, a problem in Austria still to this day that Austria never really had a denazification, a really strong denazification politics or movement going on. So in Germany, you actually see. So when I went to school, so I was born 1975, so I'm 50. I turned 50 this year. So when I went to school, to junior high school and stuff like that in the 1980s or early 90s, I remember that we had probably, I don't know, 10 or 12 hours of classes, of history classes about the Second World War. And in Germany, they pretty much like have like a whole semester or two. So there is a lot of like, because there is, of course, it's still called Germany, Nazi Germany, it's still called Germany, and the Germans always had, also maybe in relationship with the Marshall Plan and all that stuff, there was always a higher incentive for Germans to really deal with their past. Of course, Austria was part of Nazi Germany uh, pretty much from the very beginning. And 99% of all Austrians back then voted to become part of Nazi Germany. So the whole myth of Austria being the first victim of Nazi Germany is completely false. And there is this like strange hole in the soul of Austria, and I could see that in relationship to my grandparents and other grandparents, because most of them never wanted to talk about what happened during World War II. And there was always this like strange emptiness, silence about that stuff. And to a certain degree, I wanted to talk in the film about that silence, about uh, about that you never really know what was going on, at least through the filter of your grandparents. And in my case, the guy like Otto, so my maternal, from my mother's side, my grandfather who is in the film, he was kind of outspoken about what was going on, and it was kind of uh strange compared to other grandfathers of my friends. So my grandfather was talking a lot about this stuff, and he shared a lot of stories and some of like the really cheap medals he got and all that stuff. And but it was also because he was never really an ideological Nazi. Uh, and on the other side, my father's father, so my paternal grandfather, yeah, he was a hardcore Nazi. He was a Nazi even before the war started, when the Nazis were illegal in Austria, because there was something like a pre-Nazi phase in Austria, and it was called Austrofascism. So there was a fascist regime in Austria, but it was not Nazis. And those guys didn't like the Nazis, so they forbid being part of the Nazi movement. And my so that grandfather was part of that movement when it was pretty much like underground. And uh, and he also never talked about anything. He burned all his photo albums the moment the war was over, never spoke about it. So we always assumed there was some heavy shit going on that end. But with my other grandfather, we were always like in conversation about that kind of stuff, and he told us stuff He was also never on the Eastern Front. He was in the West, and and I really asked him a couple of years before he died if after his death, if I could use the stuff in the farm and his photographs or stuff that we find in my art projects, because he knew about my art projects. He knew that I was always like a like a strange little duckling, and but he always supported me. He gave me money. I think the first or second issue of Monochrome, our fanzine that we did in the early 1990s, was actually printed on the photocopying machine, the Xerox machine, at the place where he worked, which was the Conservative Party of Austria. I have to add. So that's very strange, but he was always supportive, and so when I asked him if I could use his image and his photographs and all that stuff in an art project in the future after he's dead, he said like, yeah, it's no problem, do whatever you want. I don't care, I will be dead, but I have one wish. If you should ever use me in a film, then I want to be the villain. And in a certain way, I kind of fulfilled that wish, because he is really the supervillain in the film. And he had a great sense of humor, so he would probably have laughed a lot about what we did with him.
It's really interesting what you've been saying about the Austrian silence, because a few years ago, of all people, Arnold Schwarzenegger posted a
Mhm.
video on social media talking about that very thing, and about the men he knew growing up and the sense of shame that he thought he saw in all of them.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I remember he talked about that. He talked about it even earlier, like 20 years ago, uh, where he said some like historically inaccurate things, and he was criticized for it. For example, he was back then talking about the Soviets, that he saw the Soviet occupation of Austria after 1945 when the war was over, and that he saw the tanks with his own eyes, which was impossible because he lived in the south, he lived in Styria, and Styria was not a Soviet occupied zone, because that was in the north, where I grew up, so in Vienna and around Vienna in Lower Austria, and he later then said like, yeah, that's true. I never saw the Soviet tanks, but I heard about them, and I tried to kind of like emphasize that and to talk about that, and in the end, it doesn't really matter. He was probably terrified by the whole thing as a kid and whatever. But it is interesting because like seeing like Schwarzenegger's career, that he was always a Republican. Like, I mean, there was the joke in the 1980s about Conan the Republican and that kind of stuff, and that he became like the Republican governor of California and all that stuff. But I recently saw a really good documentary, like a three-part documentary about Schwarzenegger, where in the first part, he talks about his acting career. And in the second part, now, the first part, he talks about his bodybuilding career. In the second part, he talks about his acting career. And in the third part, he talks about his politics and his political career as a governor. And there were some things in that documentary that really surprised me. For example, that uh, initially he got a lot of like resistance for stuff that he tried to do, and at some point he decided that it is just like not working in the way that he wanted it to work, so he teamed up with Democrats and did stuff in cooperation with them, because he said like, I want to do something, but if I'm getting kind of stopped all the time because there is no consens or consensual stuff happening anymore, it doesn't work. And I was super impressed by that, because what I see as the main problem nowadays in US politics is that the old thing that was always strange for Europeans, I have to say, that there are only two parties, and those two parties are kind of uh like battling each other, and it's kind of like a winner takes it all situation most of the time. uh that this is now so heavily polarized that nobody wants to talk to nobody anymore, and you can only do politics if there is some form of consensus, if there is some kind of like reaching out across the aisle to get something done. And in Europe, it wouldn't work that way, because in Europe you usually need two or three at least usually three parties to get some form of government going, because the parties are smaller, and democracy and the systems are a little bit different than in the US. So in Austria, for example, which is also related to Solvent to a certain degree, because Solvent was released in September 24, pretty much around the same time that we had our last big national election. And the main guy who became uh, who was the winner of the whole process was our Trump. So our the head of the ultra right wing party in Austria, which is called, of course, Freedom Party. As always, like if you call yourself Freedom something, you're usually a fascist. Uh, and and so the guy won with, like, I don't know, like 30% of the vote or something like that. But in Austria, to actually be able to operate, you need at least, I think, 51% of the vote as a government to be able to do something. So it wouldn't be a working government without that. And it's also it just like doesn't work. The rule set is like that. So the the ultra right wing guy, the ultra right wing party, now tried to find another party to form a coalition, and they were, of course, uh, thinking they would team up with the Conservative Party, because they had, I don't know, like whatever, like 22% or something like that, or 23, and that would end up to get over the threshold of 51%. So then they could form a coalition with the major partner being the Freedom Party, and the smaller partner being the Conservative Party. But the guy was so incapable of negotiating with the conservatives, and demanded so many ministries and this and that and blah blah blah, that the whole coalition discussion like fell apart, and the conservatives said, like, no, we're not going to work with you. It's not, no, it's not going to happen if you behave like that. Yeah. And so what happened then is that the conservatives, who were the second, of course, in command, because they had the second most votes, were teaming up with the Social Democrats and the Liberal Party, and now they are running the country. And the ultra conservative guy has nothing. In the meantime, of course, there is a lot of debate if that will only kind of like postpone the inevitable outcome, that in the next election, uh, the ultra righters will get even more votes, because the conservative part of Austria is not happy what's going on, and we're just like postponing the whole stuff till the next election. But you never know. I mean, so many things are happening. But anyhow, just like I'm just I'm telling probably too much about Austrian politics and how it works. But in the end, what I wanted to address is the fact that uh, the American system is like a massive deadlock in the meantime, and nothing happens and nothing works. And but I'm also not seeing that changing anytime soon, because I mean, you need a lot of change to nudge that into a different direction.
Your earlier comments about the pre-Nazi period in Austria reminds me of the pre-Nazi period in the United States. You know, before the war, we had the German American Bund, and they
Oh,
had
yeah, yeah, yeah.
rallies at Madison Square Garden that was packed with folks who thought Adolf Hitler was just, you know, the cat's meow, and really wanted to have us join in. And, you know, fortunately
Absolutely,
that
yeah, yeah.
that was put away pretty quickly. But
And it
still,
looks like yeah, it looks like something straight out of, like Man in the High Castle or something like that. If you watch the footage, the film footage of that Madison Square Garden like rally, you think like, the fuck is happening here? And
And a
yes,
lot of those
absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
people remained in positions of power. They just, lowered their heads and tried to stay under cover. But then they came back afterwards and started
Yeah, yeah.
very
It is
fascist.
kind of interesting. It could have gone a completely different direction. I mean, there was one. I mean, like with Lindbergh, like Lindbergh was a Nazi pretty much, like,
Yeah.
and people like Ford, like the industrialist. I mean, they were hardcore anti-Semites. Like there were many people with a lot of money. Like, and I think in a certain way, it is comparable what's going on with Musk and the elite at the moment with some of the people back then, like Ford, etc. So I mean, of course, you can't really exactly compare it because that would be a little bit reductionist, but I mean, there are some uncanny overlaps, let's say.
Yeah, this is really a pretty good segue into discussing the other film, your documentary, Hacking at Leaves. And I guess the first question and the obvious question is, what does that mean when you say hacking at leaves?
Oh, it is. It's fun because there is my character. I'm hosting the film, and the second host, so to speak, of the film is a fictitious host. It's Uncle Sam, a good friend of mine, Max Grudenchik, who was one of the Ferengis on Star Trek
Yeah, I remember him.
Star
Yeah.
Trek, yeah, Star Trek, Deep Space Nine, of course, yeah. And he plays Uncle Sam. So we both are this like strange antagonist hosts of the film. And in the end, he asks me the same question: why is the film actually called Hacking at Leaves? And there is an old saying. I'm not sure if it's a saying or if it's if it's a quote, because it is always there's one writer, is it Thoreau? I can't remember exactly, but there's one writer always been quoted with that line, and it is we have to stop hacking at leaves. We have to cut the roots, talking about problems. So people
Yeah.
are super invested in treating the symptoms of stuff that's going on. The leaves would be the symptoms,
Mm.
but we actually have to cut the problem at the roots if we want to really like create some structural change, I guess. So that's why I decided to have call it Hacking at Leaves, because at the same time the film is about hacking and hacker spaces and do it yourself. So I thought like the hacking aspect here is not the hacking of like with a garden tool, but it's the actual hacking that we know from nerd culture. But it's also it for me it fit kind of well.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I thought that was kind of a good play on words there. And my sense of that documentary is sort of like you've told the story of America, really, in that documentary. And you've told it, much of it from the perspective of the indigenous people in America. And I'm kind of wondering, so I know that your conversations with Ryan are what kind of led you into this,
Mhm,
and specifically like the work that the hackerspace was doing and all
mhm.
that. How did the indigenous people come into the film and into the consideration?
Yeah. Okay. So the story is that a good friend of mine from he lived in Durango back then. He's not living there anymore. I think it's even in the film that after the whole stuff that happened there, he decided to like he wants to move somewhere else. He's living in Boulder now. And so the story is that when the pandemic started, I realized that Ryan was posting a lot of stuff on social media, and he's usually not the guy who posts a shit ton of people of posts and or photographs on social media. And I realized that they're building something in the little hackerspace in Durango that he founded, which is part of this kind of like science museum called the Powerhouse Science Center in Durango, which was one of the first power plants, electric power plants in the United States. They built it for smelting operations because Durango was kind of like like started because of mining operations in the Rockies. And so and I sent him a message like, shouldn't you be, like socially distancing? Like in Europe, we can't even like go outside without the police like harassing us, like that we should wear masks or something like that. And so why are you sitting with like 25 people in a small room? I mean, they were all wearing masks, but why are you like congregating and not distancing? And he said like, well, the story is that the local hospitals in Durango and in Farmington in New Mexico, which is not that far, they have real problems because of the pandemic. There are hundreds and hundreds of patients coming to to the hospitals, and they're sick, and the personnel is getting sick. Like early days of COVID, nobody really knew anything, and but they knew that it's like airborne, and they needed some form of protection for the doctors and for the nurses and all that stuff, but they didn't have anything. I mean, they had one pepper unit, which is this like you've seen it before. It looks like a gas mask, but it's not a gas mask that's sitting on your face. It's kind of like a shield with a bonnet where fresh air is pumped into the whole thing, and because of the overpressure, you can actually talk and do is no. So it's not as restrictive as a gas mask, especially if you want to deal with patients and talk to people. And for example, they have one of those things, and they usually have it for the one tuberculosis case they have in a year or something like that. Yeah, but they needed many. Uh, oh yeah, absolutely wonderful. Thank you for showing it. Yeah, you can see it how that looks like, and and they needed many of those suits, but they couldn't buy them because of course all the supply lines were cut, and there was this whole thing going on with the trade war with China that Trump started, and most of that stuff came from China. La, la, la. Problem. So long story short, they decided that they were interested in trying to build pepper units, but also other gowns and masks and all kinds of medical equipment for the hospitals because they really needed that equipment. And so they got together, all capable nerds with 3D printers and equipment, and they were just like dealing with the problem and try to fix it. And within a couple of weeks, they were like a 500 people operation, making making that equipment not only for the hospitals in Durango and Farmington, but also all over the place. And I was super interested in that story because I mean I'm a very nerdy character. I like do it yourself. I like hacker spaces. I was one of the co-founders of the hackerspace in Vienna, for example, back in 2007. So I like stories like that. But my next question was actually, why are there so many patients? I mean, Durango is like 40,000 people in the middle of nowhere in the Rockies. There are millions of people coming through because it's a tourist town, but not during the pandemic. And the same is true for Farmington. So I mean, it's like 60,000 people. Most of them are working in the oil industry there, and it's a very kind of like a working class town, and not a lot of people come through. So where are all the patients coming from? And then that's the big connection to the indigenous story is they told me most of them were Navajo because the Navajo reservation is right next door, and that's 350,000 people. And the Navajo reservation is as big as Ireland. And they don't have a single hospital. They have a couple of clinics or something like that. And all the Navajos who got sick because of the structure of their society, there are so many like people living together in households, like 7, 8 people, like from babies till like grandparents, and everyone got sick. So the basic structure of Navajo society was very unfortunate for a contained situation, especially during COVID, and also the situation of like not having access to running water and all the stuff. So like all the stuff that's wrong uh, uh, on the Navajo reservation. became even worse because of the pandemic. And to tell that story, especially in a documentary, you have to explain why are there reservations, who are the Navajo. Pretty much like you have to rewind a couple hundred years and explain U.S. colonialism and manifest destiny and all that stuff to kind of understand. So it's a very local story about a local hackerspace with a local problem, but you can only understand that local problem if you pretty much like, to quote Carl Sagan, kind of like explain the universe, like when you want to make an apple pie from scratch, you have to explain the universe. And that's pretty much the story of the film. And then of course you also have to tell the story about the US healthcare system, American culture in general to a certain degree. And suddenly the film just like spiraled out of control. And one of the first cuts we made was 4 hours long. And we knew like, no, we can't do that. So we have
I
to
can
kind of like
imagine.
tame it down. We have to at least get under 2 hours. And we are super happy that we could condense it all to 108 minutes of was the final runtime of the whole thing. So that's the genesis of the whole project. Yeah.
Yeah, and you had a one guy who was a hacker and also a Navajo, right?
Oh
That
yeah,
you were
absolutely.
interviewing, but and interviewed by proxy.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah, we had the problem. So, I mean, I'm joking at one point about the whole thing that I like documenting stuff that cannot be documented because even that the doctors at the hospitals, they didn't want to be interviewed because the CEO of the hospital forbid them to be interviewed for the documentary because he was a little bit chicken shit about the whole situation. Same story with my anarcho-syndicalist Navajo hacker friend, who and I completely understand that said like I don't want to be filmed. I don't want people to know my name because I'm doing stuff as part of our resistance. Like the Dakota Access Pipeline and all that stuff. Like you know the stories. So he said like it would be detrimental to my activism if people would know my name and see me and all that stuff. And so we decided to find an actor or actress because we also didn't want to give away the gender. So we decided that our anonymous hacker should be represented by someone, and we found this wonderful, lovely Navajo actress who personifies the hacker. And he pretty much like wrote like a 5-page essay that he or she sent us, and and we couldn't really incorporate the entire 5-page essay, but I think we managed to incorporate probably at least 2 or 3 of the pages into the film, and I'm very happy that happened. And the input is really great, and there are also things in there that I could have never really said as like a white bread from Austria, but of course, our anonymous Navajo hacker could do also like in relationship to like the classism and the racism in the states, etc. etc. But super happy that it turned out the way it did.
I'm
You
super
said
impressed by the hacker approach you've taken to your film work. And it's unfortunate that it's not being done in this country as much because the whole film industry, and especially in Hollywood, is contracting. It's all being consolidated into just a small number of companies, and it's gotten horrendous where Donald Trump is actually interfering with Netflix's attempt to outbid Skydance for Warner Brothers Discovery, which is a huge film empire. So it's gotten very political, and it's just disappointing for those of us who really love film.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I have the same problem. I had the same problem on both ends. In the making, because we were of course trying to get our hands on some money also from the US, because I thought like, there might be some US sponsors or something. I know that there's not a lot of art funding in the US, but we were thinking of like maybe we can get some private money for that. And most people were kind of like reluctant. Oh, it's about the Navajo and it's about this and it's about COVID and so some of them didn't want to support something that's so political. Some of them were really like, one person really told me, uh, although that person really wants to support uh, indigenous stories or but she was really terrified by the idea of like that if she would put money into our film, that other people would see that. And also, I mean, like so many people are afraid uh, from attack from the right, but they're also afraid from attack from the left to a certain degree, because some people pretty much like straight to my face said like, uh, because the topic is also about the Navajo, people will probably attack me because like I'm the white guy. I'm paying out money because to uh, to 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 stop my white guilt or something like that. So there's people have interesting knots in their heads in the political climate nowadays, so that someone would rather not support a project about indigenous people because they're afraid that someone would criticize them that they are white saviors or something like that. I don't know. It's it's so strange. But also I have to say like a lot of that stuff is also very polarized and very exaggerated in the US. I have never seen that in that form in Europe, I have to say.
Well, it's pretty
Uh,
strange here too. I mean, it hadn't
yeah.
always been that way
Don't
here.
tell me. But I mean,
It's
for
kind of
example,
crazy.
the reason why I decided to release the film for free through the Internet Archive is not only because I like the Internet Archive and I really like a lot of people to see my film, but it was also hard to find a distribution company. And for almost a year and a half or something like that, or at least a year, we were trying to find it. And most distribution companies said like, well, it's a very experimental documentary. It's not your like classic Netflix poop cruise like documentary or something like that. People have to invest a lot of, like one quote was like, people have to invest a lot of energy into understanding the film. And I was like, oh my god, it's it's like if documentary filmmaking is only kind of like the palate cleanser for people at the end of the day, then there what is documentary filmmaking in our day and age? So they were afraid that people wouldn't be that invested into it, or it's too complicated, or it's too political. So, I mean, in the end, I didn't find a distribution company, especially in the US, which is a really important market, especially for that film, because it is about the US. And in the end, I thought, like, well, more people will probably see the film if I release it for free in the Internet Archive, and they helped me with the PR, then it's ending up on Mubi with no support and no PR behind it and nothing. At least people will see it. And the film was financed by the Austrian government and the Viennese government. So uh, I'm not negative. Like my balance is not negative. So I got the money from Austria for what I needed to finish the project. And if I'm not making any money with it, it's completely fine. At least people can see it. Because interestingly, I'm making quite some money with my horror films. So the horror films are always good sellers, and I always immediately have distribution companies or people interested in the whole thing. And so I make some money there because horror is kind of like a growing market. And I'm also very political there, but it's easier to sell it than the documentaries. But in the end, I'm happy it's out there and people can see it, and I'm happy that people will probably see it now that I'm speaking with you and go to the Internet Archive and download it. So that's good.
Well, the film kind of gets to a tension between technology as a liberating force and technology as a tool of authoritarianism. How does that
Mhm.
strike you? I mean, is it intentional that you're kind of addressing that tension, and how does that kind of I mean, how do you see that playing out in contemporary culture?
Oh, I mean, as a good old leftist, I'm always saying that whatever we do, it's like it's technology. It is like how we behave with people, what we do. I mean, everything is embedded within the greater political, societal, economical framework that we're sitting in, and technology. I'm not saying that technology is neutral. Of course, it's not, but it can't be neutral because it is technology is being developed within the societal framework of, for example, in the United States, within a very hyper-capitalist system, and we can't complain about that technology looks like it looks, because it's coming out of like a hyper-capitalist, like Silicon Valley agenda, and that is kind of like force-fed onto the world. And I mean, yeah, it's always hard to to bash the tech millionaires or bash this or bash pharma or bash that. I mean, they're all playing by the same rule set. I mean, why would they play by any other rule set if it's the dominant doctrine? So for me, for example, capitalism is not per se political. Capitalism is an economic doctrine that's dominating the globe for 300 years or something like that, and because it's the dominant doctrine, like feudalism was before, everyone is just like behaving in the way they learn and they do and they see, and where the power concentrations are with the capitalists. And the big and the horrible difference between what capitalism is now and capitalism is, I don't know, like 40 or 50 years ago, is like that some of the societal control through states uh, is like dwindling. That because there is always, as a good old leftist, I also see that at the state, the nation state is the same, is the same, is part of the same problem as capital is. But there was always an interesting balance, and you can still see that in Europe, that something like the state still has the power and the possibility of curbing and culling the excesses of market capitalism. And it's working still pretty well in places like Austria or Germany or France. But in places like the US, uh, you have on the one end the problem that the state was like, everyone has this like strange idea of like that the state should be reduced and reduced and reduced. And I hear that even from liberal friends of mine for many years. uh and in combination with the horrible stuff that's going on now with Trump and this like re-emerging fascism, uh you have kind of like an interesting, how do I even say it, it's like there's this, it's almost like this schizophrenic system going on at the time that doesn't know where to go and what to do. And the only people that are profiteering from that is the CEOs and the shareholders of the big companies, especially in the tech sector. I hope I wasn't too confusing about what I said, but I
Well,
was trying to make up my mind while talking to you.
one aspect of what we have in America is this sort of like democratic vision, the democratic intention, our attempts to be egalitarian and our attempts to be inclusive and so forth. And then we have, as you refer to it, hyper-capitalism. We have extremes of capitalism. And when capitalism is really extreme, it is ultimately it exploits kind of everything in its path. It exploits human resources, it exploits natural resources, and it exploits politics too, to its own ends. And right now we have people who have taken power who are really just about their own profit. That's where
Yeah,
they're
yeah,
focused.
yeah,
I mean, it's very obvious with Donald Trump.
yeah, 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 yeah.
Everything he's doing is to fill his pockets. So we've I mean, I see the kind of schizophrenia you're talking about. On the one hand, we have a very elegant vision of what a society can be. And then on the other hand, you have a fairly coarse, sort of
Yeah,
exploitative regime that is usually sort of, I mean, there's a tension between those two, and that
yeah, 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 yeah.
kind of
Absolutely.
it kind of drifts back and forth.
Yeah.
And at this point, we're at a kind of extreme in a direction that makes a lot of us very concerned.
Oh, yeah, yeah,
Uh, you know,
yeah,
and
yeah. I
I
see.
guess one question for you is, in the back of your mind, do you have ideas of solutions for the kinds of problems that you're revealing and articulating
Oh, oh my God. I
in the
mean, yeah,
film?
it's that's hard. That's hard. I mean, I want to rewind a little bit because but of course, that's my own ideological background is that I don't really believe that there is a good or a bad capitalism. But capitalism, from my point of view, is always bad because capitalism is a certain rule set how to deal with power and resources, human resources and natural resources, and within this, that's the classic Marxian uh, uh, analysis that there is that rule set per definition is exploitative. There can never be a non-exploitative capitalism, yeah. But there are possibilities to try to control the excesses of capitalism. So if you have something like, for example, in Austria or France, you have mandatory 5 weeks of vacation for everyone who is in the workforce. Uh, there is still, of course, people are being exploited and workers are being exploited, and capital is still accumulating wealth. But at least we get 5 weeks of paid vacation every year. And in the US, you can be happy if you have a week or something like that. So that's so like what people call the welfare state is just like one way of like curbing the excesses of capitalism and giving people the possibility of a little bit of freedom, of a little bit of time. I mean, the whole idea of like having like 8 hours of sleep and 8 hours of work and 8 hours of leisure time in the day is not that old, and that had to be fought for through unions and stuff like that.
And
If that would
nationalized
would not have
healthcare is
happened, then we would still be having like 12-hour, 14-hour work days.
and nationalized healthcare is absolutely fundamental for that.
Absolutely, absolutely. In a certain way, that's also part of the documentary, that kind of like also showing uh, how where that can lead if everything is if the health of people. I mean, of course, there are pharma companies in Austria as well, and there is pharma interests, and of course, people go to doctors and they get medicine and they have to buy them, etc. I mean, like we all living in a capitalist system, also in Europe, but at least. You don't have to worry about the situation that you get cancer and then you can decide if you want to be bankrupt or healthy, or stuff like that. So that is horrible. What I never got in the US is how that element of healthcare could be so polarized and so politically charged, so that health, like universal or free universal healthcare, and of course free universal healthcare is also not free in Austria, but at least it is affordable. But how that aspect of society was so hypercharged by the conservatives with the idea of like communism, like if we get free healthcare, we're all communists or something like that, is just like this, just like it's blowing my mind how that happened. And of course it's always because of interests and lobbyists and the companies who want to make money, and of course, but in the States they let them do it, and in Europe we never let them, because at some point we said like the even the most conservative ultra right winger in Austria would never ever touch healthcare, never ever. What they would probably say is something like, "Oh, the migrants were coming in. The migrants, they 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 also get the pills from the doctor, but they also get, I don't know, like 70% off or something like that. They only should get 40% off." So that's that's pretty much like how the right wingers in Austria would argue in that situation. But there would never ever be a discussion about that kind of stuff. And I mean, you're based in the UK, and the UK has also problems with healthcare, so it's not paradise or something like that. But at least there is a certain minimum standard. I hope you agree with that.
Yeah, no one goes bankrupt because they got sick.
Yeah, and that should be the minimum standard,
Right.
at
I
least.
agree.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But the question that John that you asked is like, what are my solutions? I mean, poof, it's I mean, the problem system in the US is very polyvalent, and it's kind of hard to kind of like copy paste it onto Europe and say like, okay, you should just do this and this and then it works. But because of course the US history of racism is a different history than we have. So like there was never like slavery in Austria or Germany or something like that. And also the different countries in Austria are also very different cultures, and they have different approaches to how they do things. But but the element of racism in the US is a very special element. Uh, that sometimes I have the feeling is a little bit in the public discussion about politics is a very dominant discussion. So it's kind of like it's occupying a lot of discussions in the US that should be discussed at a different level. So, for example, uh, I think that certain elements of racism in the US are way more classism than they are racism, because there is a strong overlap with race and ethnical diversities in the US, and also classism of like lower income situations. And there sometimes I guess there are some debates should not be about race, but they should be about class, and some and vice versa. So there are some strange effects in that case in the US, but that's hard. And then of course you have the whole debate about that unions got completely destroyed pretty much like in the early 20th century, or that many people have the feeling of like if they're supporting a union, they're supporting the mafia. So there there's so many things that need to be cleaned up, and certain people don't have the power to do that, or some people have the power but they're not interested in doing that because it's against their better interest
Well,
in the whole game. Yeah,
I'm of an age where I remember when money was not the controlling factor in things like music and film
yeah,
and the media. It, uh, I worked in music and journalism in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and I found that when the accounting departments and the investors suddenly took over, that's when the soul was pretty much sucked out of a lot of things like music
yeah,
and film and media. And it's only gotten worse now.
yeah, yeah. When the bean counters took over, yeah, yeah. And that's pretty much, it's interesting. It's the same in the music industry, it's the same in the healthcare industry, especially in 1980s. I mean, people need to give Ronald Reagan way more credit than he gets for all the awfulness that's going on.
Oh, we
Because
give
the
him a
whole
lot of
the
credit.
Yeah, yeah, but way more, way more, way more. Because people, I,
Yeah.
I I heard also conservative peoples who are not Trumpists say something like, "Well, Reagan was a good guy, and what Trump is doing right now is kind of like over the top, and that should not happen, and I don't like that." So of course, because there's also debate within the Conservative Party about some of that stuff, but but it's hard to compare Trump to Reagan, yeah. But I mean, Reagan was an awful fuck. Oh my God, the whole deregulation stuff that he started with most of that. Oh my God, I mean that kicked off so much stuff that is still to blame for many things that happen. I mean, the whole situation with Fox News is
Yeah.
Reagan made.
Those are some of the
And
roots you were talking about that we need to hack at instead of hacking at the leaves, I
yeah,
guess.
yeah. I mean,
There
it's
are
kind of
roots
hard
of
to
what
go
we
back
have
in
today.
time. I'd love to have like a time, like a DeLorean time machine, to go back in time and uh, try to to convince people of not voting for Reagan. It would have not worked anyways because people were.
We tried at the time, you know.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Didn't
Thank you
succeed.
for your service. Absolutely.
Yeah. So
And yeah,
we are
but
at
still,
the
yeah,
end.
yeah.
We're at the end of our hour, and this has been a fantastic conversation. Really, I'm all fired up right now. Well, I can think of a lot more to say, and maybe you can come back and join us another time.
Sure, absolutely. It's always
That would be
fun to hang out
great.
with you guys, and yeah, let's do it.
Yeah. So, thanks so much for joining us, and we will see you soon.
You can stay in touch with Plutopia at plutopia.io. On Facebook, look for @Plutopia News. On Twitter, it's @Plutopia. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.